Good morning, everybody here in the United States. Good afternoon, good evening to those who are further abroad. I'm Matthew Levitt, Director of the Reinhardt Program on Counterterrorism and Intelligence here at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. And I'm thrilled to have with us today Marc Hecker and Elie Tenenbaum to speak with us at today's counterterrorism lecture series. We also have with us Louis Dugigros, who is a visiting fellow here at the Washington Institute and a French diplomat. And I'm thrilled that Louis will offer some comments after Marc and Elie give their opening remarks. Marc Hecker is Director of Research and Communications at the French Institute of International Relations, IFRI, and is Editor-in-Chief of Politique Etrangere. Elie Tenenbaum is a research fellow at IFRI and director of its Security Studies Center. Together, they are co-authors of a new book just released several weeks ago. In English, it is called The 20-Year War, Jihadism and Counterterrorism in the 21st Century. You can find more information about the book on IFRI's website. For those of you who are on the webinar, we'll be putting a link to the book in the chat function. Marc and Elie will kick us off with some opening remarks that are on the record. Louis will then give some commentary. I will kick off the Q&A with a couple of questions, and then we will take the Q&A to our audience. Those of you who are participating via the Zoom webinar function will be able to ask questions via the Q&A button that is in the bottom middle of your screen. And those of you who are watching live on YouTube will be able to send questions in via email to the email address policyforum@washingtoninstitute.org. That's policyforum@washingtoninstitute.org. Those questions will all be forwarded into me, and we'll get to as many of those questions as we can. Marc, Elie, Louis, thank you in advance. Let me turn the floor over to you.
Many thanks, Matt, for your introduction, and many thanks to your team at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy for organizing this event. I'm going to share my screen now. Can you see the slides? Yeah, great. So with Elie, as you said, we just published this book in French, La Guerre de Vingt Ans, and we're going to offer you a brief view of our main arguments. So we had three objectives. The first one was to write the history of the war on terror. The second one was to analyze the strategic dynamics of the conflict. And the third one was to draw the strategic lessons of the war on terror. And of course, now I'm going to insist on this last point, the strategic lessons of the war on terror. And to do so, we're going to answer three questions with Elie. Is the war on terror coming to an end? Who won the war? And what are the lessons learned for the West? So what we did is that we analyzed 5 phases of the war on terror, and for each phase, we tried to draw the strategic lessons. That is to say that we wrote 3 to 4 pages of lessons at the end of each of these 5 parts of our book. And of course, I cannot sum up all these strategic lessons, but what I'm going to do now is just to highlight 1 or 2 things that worked or did not work for each of this phase. So the first phase, of course, started with 9/11 and the opening of a new strategic cycle, the cycle of the global war on terror. And the first phase goes from 2001 to 2006, and it showed already the limits of US military and interventionism. So what worked during this period? The West managed to destroy terrorist sanctuaries and to disrupt international jihadi organizations through an effective combination of intelligence and strikes. However, on the other hand, post-intervention stabilization was insufficiently planned. And after the phase of regime change, the willingness to build liberal democracies from scratch proved to be naive. And an important lesson from this period is that intervention may actually create more trouble than it's worth. The second period goes from 2006 to 2011. On the positive side, Western armed forces managed to adapt their strategy and to switch to a counterinsurgency mode. With enough boots on the ground and appropriate tactics, techniques, and procedures, it was actually possible to stabilize a situation that seemed desperate. But on the negative side, it's very hard to follow multiple coin campaigns in the long run due to war fatigue and resource exhaustion. Plus, we also saw a strong dependence on the local elites who appeared incapable of building a genuine national project. The third phase goes from 2011 to 2014. It's the Arab Spring and what we call Jihadism's revenge. But it's also during this period that the French intervention in the Sahel region started. And actually it worked pretty well, at least in the beginning. And it showed that another way than US-led intervention was possible. So it was interventions led by US allies. In this case, it was France in Mali with Operation Serval. And actually, this operation managed to stop the jihadi tide, at least locally and temporarily. What didn't work during this period, especially with regards to Arab Spring, was the inability to envision strategic surprise and to anticipate the faculty of the jihadis to take advantage of the instability fostered by the Arab revolutions. The fourth phase goes from 2014 to 2017. What worked was the aptitude to destroy ISIS sanctuary with a lighter footprint and a lower political commitment than previously. And it was also due to perhaps a better suited partner capacity building. But on the negative side, we showed an inability to contain terror threats to the Middle East. The wave of terror attacks in Europe exposed the limits of city cooperation and the failures of intelligence in certain EU countries. And the last phase, we called it the strange victory. It's of course a hint at the strange defeat by the French historian Marc Bloch. This period goes from 2017 to today. And on the positive side, we witnessed a capacity to reduce the level of threat in Western countries and to avoid so far the constitution of a new sanctuary. However, the West showed a limited ability to influence social and political dynamics on the ground. Western interventions actually do not manage to tackle the roots of radicalization and terrorism. And what's more, during this period, the US appeared as a quite unreliable ally. Distrust grew among its partners like the Kurds or even the Europeans. So why is this strategic cycle ending now? There are basically three reasons. The first one is linked to tactical successes. There's a relative weakening in jihadi groups' ability to project global violence. Basically, ISIS and AQ Central are in decline. However, there's a strategic frustration with a Western war fatigue due to an inability to produce satisfactory political output. And there are also, of course, now new priorities trumping counterterrorism. We can name great power competition, the pandemic, or even climate change. I hand over the floor to Elie now.
Okay, thank you, Mark, and thank you, Matt, for the invite. I follow on just on that. So basically, as Mark just said, if we accept the idea that the war on terror, as we knew it, which is not the fight against jihadi terrorism, but just a specific strategic cycle that started with 9/11, and put the struggle against terrorism as a paramount dimension of Western national security policy. This strategic cycle is coming to an end for the reasons that Mark just mentioned. Then we thought that it was legitimate for the wider public and possibly the students of conflicts that we are to ask who did won this concept, this contest. Of course, this is an easy and simple question to which there is no easy and simple answer, but we didn't want to avoid it or just sweep it away like it like that, like it didn't matter. So we did try to find some ways to answer it, of course, in a nuanced fashion, and one way was to look at the goals of war. What were the goals of war when it started with 9/11? Fortunately for us, we have a lot of sources about the jihadi terrorist goals that have been repeatedly reinstated in the numerous propaganda and internal documents, and we can resume them in three fashion. One is to clear the Muslim world from the Jews and the Crusaders, to use their language, and especially from the Islamic holy sites. Second one is to bring down the apostate regimes of the Muslim world, and finally, ultimately, to proclaim a caliphate with the diverging views between ISIS, AQ, and others as regards to the timing to which this should happen. But this is quite a consistent goal of war. In 2005, Al-Qaeda even published a 20-year strategic plan envisioning a strategic achievement of these three goals by, I give you 2022. So they're a bit late on their schedule, and quite clearly looking at the Muslim world right now, and even just at the Middle East, it's clear that they do not have much results to brag about. Of course, you'll tell me Afghanistan and the Taliban victory is a start. It is, but it is also a far cry from total victory, which you may read about sometimes in papers stating, hey, Bin Laden has won. We don't think it's the case, and we actually think it's important to stress that. Now, what about counterterrorism goals? These were not clearly symmetric. This was not a zero-sum game, and the absence of victory from the jihadis were not ever sufficient goals for Western counterterrorism and even wider counterterrorism parties. If we look at what George W. Bush said September 20, 2001 about the war on terror, that it would not end until every terrorist groups of global reach, and I insist on that, has been found, stopped, and defeated. And even if this goal varied over time, Barack Obama, Donald Trump had other ways to say it and to nuance it. In France ourselves, we had various statements and various variations about his goals. This remained usually the kind of a horizon, however vague, about the goals of counterterrorism. Now, of course, if we look at the progress of jihadism and terrorism since September 11, you tell me, again, this is a far cry from victory. If we use the global terrorism database between 9/11 and 2014, we had a number of deaths from terrorism that was multiplied by 7. There's quite a large decrease between 2014 and today. We wait for the final, the new 2021 global terrorism index to be published, but it's quite clear that there's a good trend here, but we're still with much more death from terrorism than it used to be before 9/11. And of course, if we look at the number of fighters, for instance, which is another figure, number of active Saudi jihadist fighters, these are the discussed figures from the CSIS report a few years ago. At least the trend is quite clear that there was no decline, quite the contrary of the number of jihadi fighters in the world after 2001. Now, does it mean that that counterterrorism goals has been as much a failure as that of jihadism. You could think that also looking at the geographical spread of the jihadi threats. We had this map done for the book, looking at the main in Eurasian and African landmass localization of active terror groups. Red is Al Qaeda related, black is ISIS related, but in the same time, it's worth asking yourself how much these terror groups and jihadi organizations are indeed of global reach, to use George W. Bush phrase at the time, and you could definitely argue that most, not all of them, but most of these organizations at this point mostly have a local to regional reach and not necessarily of global reach, which let's say incites us to put in perspective of the results of this efforts. Now, of course, and the final point is important, it's been clear all along that the war on terror was not only a war against organization, it was also a war of ideas, and has been labeled like that from the beginning. Other terms were used. But an interesting point is that, of course, war of ideas is notoriously hard to assess, although we can use, and we did use some tools such as opinion polls and surveys. Those of the Pew Research Center have been quite interesting and useful. And if we look at them, it looks like there's a general decline over the positive opinion towards jihadi organization or key jihadi figures such as Osama bin Laden or Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, and it looks like, even though that there's a sort of a hardcore sympathizers to jihadi ideas, that the trend was going in the good way. In the same time, we should keep in mind as to what we'll look at and what is the perimeter of the war of ideas. For instance, if we'll look at political Islam or Islamism as something which is very different than jihadi or jihadism, well, political Islam has a very different trend than jihadi figures, depending on with quite an upward trend. So depending on whether you consider there's a continuum, and you know that there's a big debate about that in the French literature, but not only, between the two, you may consider it a problem or not. So that's at least the key point about the war of ideas. Now, reaching the end, what about the key lessons to be learned? Key point, and that's, I think, the final conclusion in the book. We need to avoid two pitfalls, two traps that we actually fall into on various occasions over the last 2 decades. One is underestimation, the other is overreaction. Underestimation, we had that before 9/11, and we had it again before the rise of ISIS in 2014. Remember Barack Obama calling them a bunch of JV team, well, and definitely in Europe, not willing to look at the consequences of the skyrocketing number of foreign fighters and the consequences for our own security. History shows that we should take the jihadists seriously. They have declared war on the infidels, and that includes, of course, the West quite generally, but also much wider than that. And they just not the kind of enemies that we can walk away from or turn them back on. In other words, there's no such thing as declare victory and run in front of jihadism, and the fact that they are not defeated, and it's quite clear that they are not defeated, even if they are limited in their own scope or ability right now, we should take them seriously. At the same time, overreaction is another pitfall, because we should never forget that terrorism is a weapon of the weak that basically bets on its opponents' ability to overreact and foster a new constituency that they didn't have before. And obviously, decisions such as going to war in Iraq for the United States at the global level, or even much smaller decisions, and we definitely probably had some even in France, about the anti-terrorism measures that you take. You need always to be cautious that you do not alienate or throw anyone that is not a jihadi into the jihadist arms just by sort of confirming the jihadi narrative up to some point. And this is always a fine line, because we need to fight the jihadism, but we also should not give them more credit than they should have. Second point is that the fight against terrorism and jihadi terrorism especially is a marathon rather than a sprint. It's quite clear, due to parallel priorities to CT, or alternative priorities to CD that Marc has mentioned, the fight of terrorism against terrorism can no longer remain the cornerstone of Western national security agenda, as it has been for the last 20 years, even in a declining manner. And therefore, we need to learn to keep it on the tracks with less resources, which may be a good thing, by the way, because it would mean also less political pressure to achieve urgent goals in a limited time. And God knows that this kind of political pressure sometimes led us to counterproductive moves. So it means no more surges, counterinsurgency, or quick impact. We need to spend $2 billion on this country in 2 months anymore. We're in it for the long run, and we need to learn to consume less resources, just as marathonians are eating less calories than sprinters, and it's quite clear on these pictures that we need to find new ways to be enduring and lasting, because this is going to be a lasting fight. This is going to be a generational fight. And it's just not viable to have it on the tracks with tens or hundreds of billions of dollars a year spending worldwide. Now, this one of the way of doing that is, of course, to limit our political ambition. No more regime change or transformational diplomacy. We need to bear in mind that what we can actually achieve. And at the same time, it is all the most important not to fall into some kind of cynicism by, for instance, coming to terms with the kind of authoritarian states and regimes that do generate the kind of violent extremist opposition that will then turn against us. And again, this is a fine line by looking between looking at the world as it is and acknowledging the fact that if we don't pressure some partners back into the right line, we will just nurture the system that will generate the terrorists of tomorrow's. And this is a kind of dilemmas that, for instance, France has been dealing with in the Sahel in the last time, between kind of realism and not falling into cynicism. Another aspect of this sort of marathonian approach and limiting our ambition is that when there's no other viable alternative or politically viable alternative, we should like at least Mark and I think we should look seriously at the negotiating options with some jihadi groups, especially when they have a notoriously local agenda that we may deem regrettable, but is not straightforward threat to our interests. But again, this being said, we should do that with no naiveness, looking at the jihadis for what they are, taking this seriously in their intent to harm either international order or on very own interests, looking at their international connections, their allies, and who they're hosting. And in the end, acknowledging that these negotiations should never, ever prevent us from exerting coercion. Reevaluating the importance of the fight against terrorism should be the end goal of all this lessons learning. If we can do all this, we should be able, I think, to find a right place for the fight against terrorism, which is neither the alpha and the omega of national security agenda. We should accept that this is no longer the case, and they are other priorities, but in the same times to keep fight against jihadi terrorism and wider terrorist threats in the right place that they rightfully should occupy in our national security priorities and agenda. I leave it there. I think we've been too long already. I have been too long because Mark's been sharp on the clock. But of course, we wait for the discussion with Louis and all of you guys.
Super. So let me turn it straight over to Louis for his comments, and then we'll start the Q&A. Louis?
Thank you very much, Matt, and thanks, Mark and Elie, for your presentation. I will keep it brief to save time for Q&A. It was really a fascinating presentation, and I think it's the first time that French authors tackling CT are doing it at a global level and not only at French level. So it's very interesting. I think there are a number of lessons that we can learn from your presentation. The first is that it's interesting to see that no one really fulfilled their goals of war. Of course, the terrorist groups did not. It was the result of Western interventions, as you mentioned, but the Westerners did not fully either. You mentioned the increase of active fighters, the geographical spread, especially in Africa. And listening to you, I wonder if it's not the result of an asymmetry of will between the different parties. You have on one side a high morale in terrorist groups that is fed by this global narrative of the war against terror, and on the other side you have the fatigue of public opinions in the West. I think you felt that in particular in the US. And it's also interesting that you outlined that the war against terror cannot be won by only military tools. And it's interesting to consider the evolution of the French operations in Sahel in that regard. With this emphasis on the increase of local capabilities, local military capabilities, but also what is being done in terms of governance and development with the Alliance Force Sahel. So I think it would be interesting in the Q&A, for instance, to mention this. Maybe one last point. You mentioned that there are new priorities. The competition between great powers, the climate change. I wonder if we're not underestimating the effect that those trends could have on the terrorist scene. For instance, climate change is an issue that will create a lot of movements in local populations. That is something that could fit terrorist groups. So it would be great to have your take on this. Thank you to you two for your fascinating presentations, and Matt, over to you for Q&A.
First, Marc, Elie, do either of you want to respond to the issues that Louis just raised?
Yeah, sure. I can start and then Elie. First, you mentioned no one really fulfilled the goals of war. That's true. That's what Elie mentioned in his presentation. And I think that it means that we should, on our side, on the Western side, shift from an eradication logic. Basically, that was the goal of war at the beginning. And George W. Bush mentioned that in the US in 2001. But interestingly enough, the French authorities said the same thing in 2015 after the terrorist attacks in France, saying we have to eradicate now the threat. And the fact is that we do not manage to eradicate terrorist groups. So we have to move from this eradication logic to a containment logic. We have to live with a minimal level of threat and to be able abroad to contain the threat to certain regions. So it's quite clear now for the French in the Sahel region that it's now unreachable to try and eradicate whether Al-Qaeda link group or ISIS group in Mali, in Burkina Faso, in Niger. But what we want to avoid above all is that this threat spread to other parts of Western Africa, where the Western interests are higher, and especially the French interests are higher. So again, it's perhaps less ambitious, but more realistic. With regards to the asymmetry of will, I'd say that it's only part of the explanation. The asymmetry in general, I think can be mentioned, and especially what was obvious with regard to our interventions abroad, whether the US intervention in Afghanistan, in Iraq, or the French intervention in Afghanistan as well, or later in Iraq and Syria, or now in the Sahel region. It's obvious that we do not know the geographical terrain and the human terrain as well as the jihadis themselves. I mean, they know their insurgency lessons really well, and they apply them really well. And it's much harder to be a counterinsurgent than an insurgent in this situation. I mean, that's what Galula wrote decades ago, and we've been observing that now for 20 years. Elie, do you want to comment on these issues and perhaps also on climate change and the impact on terrorism?
Yeah, absolutely. I'll be quick. The asymmetric question is key, of course, and we've known that for years. And I'll rejoin with Marc, saying that it is not only a question of asymmetry of will, it's also a symmetry of knowledge, of and of perception, and of ability to enforce political change on the ground. And I think that this has been part of what Marc said at the beginning, on the one of the reasons why war on terror was coming to an end. We embarked on this war with kind of a global vision, and then trying to apply it to the local level, saying, okay, we have this global eradication or even sometimes containment approach to jihadi terrorism, and then we're going to apply in this or that country. But what we saw was that at the local level, things were much more fluid than what we felt at the global level. And we often got played by the local actors, putting etiquettes on this or that organization, and in the same time they were ready to, I mean, they had been living with them for long times, and they were not necessarily labeled as jihadists before. They moved to some sort of jihadism realm, but right now, and this is why also to the negotiation, I know that there's a negotiation question coming. We had a difficult time to assess what could be in the bargain and what not, and this is because of this sort of asymmetry of perception, because on a local Iraqi perspective, local Malian perspective, dealing with the jihadis does not mean the same thing as from a Western perspective, because these are local actors that are gonna live with them, and definitely up to a point, the jihadis did a better job as going local as with it, and embracing on local agendas. On the aspect that not only military dimension is important, you're right to point at that. And France has been quite keen on branding the defense, diplomacy, and development, the 3Ds approach. That would be the sort of comprehensive approach to fighting terrorism. And at the same time, I think we have to acknowledge that we are experiencing trouble as the US did in the US, in Afghanistan or in Iraq or elsewhere, to get things moving in the governance dimension, the local governance dimension, because again, the military side, even the development side and the diplomatic side, we can move them from a global perspective, but it's harder to move actors on the governance part, because this is a truly local dimension. This is what Malians, what the Afghans want to do with their own governments, and this we kind of have trouble to cope with, and I think we're still experiencing a very big difficulty to move beyond a military approach, because we do not find the right ways to move there. The alternative dimensions, climate change and great power competition impacting tourism, I 100% agree with that. I personally think that terrorism is going to be radically changed by a great power competition, especially as we see more states willing to sponsor terrorism than in the 2000s and 2010s periods. And what we saw in Afghanistan in 2021 is definitely something telling about the future. Who are the Taliban right now? They are people who have state sponsorship from Pakistan, Iran, Qatar, Russia, connections with China, a lot of people, a lot of the states who are actors in the great power competition. And this is something that will possibly take us back to what terrorism was at a point in the Cold War era. And I think also that Iran is definitely showing the path here. With its connections and its use of terrorism as it has been ever since 1979. And so great power competition is going to have a huge impact on terrorism and the fight against terrorism. We could no longer separate the two, same as climate change. But let's just say that these new challenges will sort of digest the fight against terrorism up to a point. And so yes, it is going to have tremendous impact on that. I'll leave it there, and I see that questions are coming on the chat.
Super. So let me ask one or two quick questions, and we have a few questions that have come in via email and via the Q&A function. First, I just, when you started off and you were saying like, who won, I got a little nervous. And then you went into to explain what you meant by that. We had a study here at the Washington Institute several months ago looking at some of the same big questions. And our first strategic recommendation was that counterterrorism should no longer be viewed in terms of victory or defeat, but rather as an ongoing effort, short of war and peace. And so one of the questions I think we're all grappling with, and I heard this in your presentation too, is how do we do this over the long term, making it more rational, more sustainable, but still addressing the threats that are presented to us? And that draws me to two questions. One is, how do we address groups that appear today to be local, but that possibly have either greater ideological ambitions, or we're concerned that with time, as they perhaps succeed locally, could have more global ambitions? Think of Hayat Tahrir al-Sham in Syria, or other kind of Al-Qaeda affiliated or Al-Qaeda adjacent organizations. Should we be dealing with them separately, differently today because right now they are local? How do we assess concerns about the fact that they could be successful locally and grow globally? Let me ask that question first. I have one more related to this, and then we'll open up to Q&A.
Mark, you go for it, or you want me to jump on that?
Yeah, perhaps on the two issues that you raised. I mean, how do we last? And we fully agree, by the way, with what you wrote on your report about the fact that we should not think in terms of victory or defeat. We have exactly the same point in our book. So we have to be able to last with the threat and to be able to have a lighter military footprint. And here I think that France is actually an interesting model, because we are able actually to last for years with a few thousand military people in the Sahel. Of course, when you have that number, you cannot fully change the dynamics of a conflict. So that's the hard part. And basically, my point is that when we have tactical counterterrorism successes, and we've had a few over the past year in the Sahel, with the elimination of major terrorists from ISIS and from Al-Qaeda, from Jenim, I think that this should be the golden hour to move really forward politically and socially. But in order to do that, you need to have not only the military side, but also the development and the diplomatic side. And we go back to what we said before. So far, we probably do not invest enough in these two other areas. Plus, it's very hard to rely on the right actor locally. So that's for your first point. But the point that you can actually last with a few thousand military people and have some clout on a conflict, I think is important. You do not need to deploy 20,000 personnel to have an effective action on a theater. The second point is about a local group. The first thing is that you have to be sure that they are really local. So if there were previously global groups and they split with, let's say, Al-Qaeda in the case of Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, then you need evidence that they really split. Hayat Tahrir al-Sham actually walked the talk. There are a few studies showing that and showing that the way they behave towards Tanzim Houas al-Din, for instance, shows that they are really now in an opposition with global terrorist groups. Then, I mean, for France, it's really complicated to deal with these Islamist local groups. And even internally in France, we've moved toward a tougher stance toward Islamism. That's something new in the country over the past year or so. So far, we rely on other countries to establish the links with these local groups. In the case of Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, a case in point is Turkey, and we know that the relations between France and Turkey are quite bad at the moment. So we don't have, I guess, good lessons to give on this specific issue, but my main recommendation would be to ask for evidence that the group is no longer global, and if it had relations with a global entity before, perhaps go as far as to ask the group to hand over global terrorists.
I mean, just very two fingers on that, but very quick. But I think we should wait and see is a good approach. That we should be cautious. We know where they're coming from, what kind of background coming from, but at the same time, history shows that it happens that groups can move away from a trajectory. The Viet Cong didn't necessarily remain a hardcore expansionist, communist organization after the Vietnam War. Organizations can change, and it's important to keep having good look on them, and of course to be ready to intervene if the global dimensions grows back again. But also it's still possible for them to take a different path.
So my next question is this. The US has kind of been the forward-leaning global leader on these military interventions around the world for the past 20 years. And that appears to be coming to a close, right? And so this idea that we've had over 20 years from an American perspective of a US-led partner-enabled posture will lead, but we just ask that all of our partners play their role. That's changing. And now a very, very rare point of bipartisan agreement here is a new idea where we're saying, listen, where terrorists are going to be threatening the United States, the homeland, or US interests abroad, we'll be there. But if terrorists are going to be threatening something closer to France or closer to somebody else, you should take the lead. And partner-led and US-enabled, that is a huge flip and is going to demand much more resource allocation from a great many more partners around the world. From a French perspective, I'm really eager in your sense of how this flip in the US approach to counterterrorism, at least as it's envisioned, will affect French counterterrorism posture moving forward.
I'll jump on that, Marc, if you look. I think that this has been in the Sahel. This has been the French expectations all the way. French has been on the forefront of the fight in the Sahel with a good deal of US help from the very beginning in intelligence, ISR, air refueling, diplomatic support, and all that. And France is definitely pushing for a sustained US support, but never for US lead in the frame. Now, of course, this all depends on the shoulders of the partner that would lead the effort in the different corners. And for the US perspective, it means that sometimes you have to rely on partners that, of course, have their own agenda, but also have their own fragilities and limited resources. So leading from behind is not always, it means for the US accepting that all their objectives would not necessarily be been ticked on the list. But I think for France, it's cool, if I may say, at least in the Sahel region, to have this sort of partner-led effort with a sustained US support, which has a limited political cost. And I think after Tango, after the 2017 attack that cost the lives of 4 US Special Forces operator, it became clear that the US will no longer pay the blood price in the Sahel, but they will remain as a reliable and a long endurance supporter there. And this is what France is looking towards.
Super. Marc, did you want to say something?
I just want to highlight the word that Elie mentioned, reliable. At some point under Trump, the reliability was called into question, and I guess that on both sides you have to be, when you work with partners, you're sometimes frustrated by your partner, and if you rely too much on your partner, then you're dependent. And I guess that for France and Europe, it was also a call for action that we need to be more independent militarily as well.
Thank you. So I want to go to the questions from our participants. We've got a few on email and we've got a few in the Q&A. I want to remind people, if you're on the webinar, you can ask questions through the Q&A function, that bottom in the button in the bottom middle of your screen. You can also send in questions to the email address policyforum@washingtoninstitute.org. So I'm going to combine two questions from two different people right now. Is there somewhat of a continuum between jihadism, the subject of your book, and other types of terrorism that we're facing today? To put another way, to read one of the questions that came in, how does the rise of violent far-right and white supremacist terrorism factor into the phases that you've proposed?
I think Marc,
there's a mirroring effect between the far right and jihadists. And actually, we end the book with this comparison because the threat of the far right is growing in Europe. As you know, the bloodiest terrorist attack in Europe in 2020 was not perpetrated by jihadists, but by the far right. It was in Germany. And in France, we've had a number of plots that were foiled over the past 3 years coming from the far right. So the jihadist threat is still much higher than the far right, to be clear, in Europe and for sure in France. But the far right threat is growing, and we see that the way they try to foster some kind of bipolar confrontation within the society is in a way similar. So we have to be very careful, not only of the evolution of jihadi groups, but also of the far right, because we know for sure that if there were more attacks coming from the far right, then there would be a spiraling effect and a rise of violence in general.
That's part of the overreaction dynamic that the jihadists do bet on, and if overreaction does not come from the state, well, it may actually come from the far right, and that's always a possibility.
Just to be more precise, the figures from the French Ministry of Interior is that from since 2017, that is to say the election of Macron, there were approximately 30 jihadi plots foiled in France, and approximately 6 from the far right.
Will be interesting is if the discrepancy in those trends continues. So that those are the numbers in France. In other countries, even in Europe, and certainly here in the United States, the balance between plots from different types of violent actors is shifting. And with time, that could create a discrepancy among allies between how we see different types of threats. One of the questions that came in via the Q&A is, you mentioned negotiating without being naive. What types of negotiations, formal or informal, with terrorists are envisioned regarding what types of issues? So when would negotiations be wise? Under what types of issues? What would be the issues that would make negotiations a smart tactic or one that isn't relevant?
Well, yeah, please, Elie.
Obviously, any kind of claims from jihadi organization that we think we can live with, in terms of key security interests, is something that are worth looking at, especially when we see mostly local governance claims from jihadi groups, and here I'm thinking about the Sahel, and I'm not saying that JNIM or AQIM right now do have the only local claims, but looking at the sociology of some of these groups and how most of the fighters join in, it's quite clear that negotiating or making some political offers, putting some political offers on the table, may solve a good number of the problems of why the people join in the organization. Good example is the Sahwa movement in Iraq, 2006-7. 100,000 roughly fighters who had joined in the fight with Al-Qaeda in Iraq decided to turn away from this alliance because at some point they were offered political offsets by the Americans and the Iraqi government, sort of strong armed by Petraeus, to be basically rehabilitated within Iraqi politics, and to a good number of Sunni tribal fighters, this was mostly what they were interested in. If we look at the Fulani insurgency dimension in the center of Mali right now, I think that some offers could actually make a switch of alliance of a number of militias in the center away from AQIM and the hardcore jihadists. I think you'll always have hardcore jihadists that will not be interested in negotiation, and that we should not be interested in negotiating with them. But the bulk of the fighters often have a much more local interest into political bargaining, power broking, and I think this should be options that should be on the table.
Just to finger on that, I don't know if we should negotiate with jihadists. The fact is that there were 2 coups in Mali over the past 2 years, and the new military government wants to negotiate with jihadists, and it's a very contentious issue. The French government does not want that, and basically the Malians say, but the jihadists are Malians, we need a national reconciliation, we need to talk. And perhaps that our recommendation would be that we should not systematically block this kind of initiative and be more open, because it may lead to something positive on the one hand, and on the other hand, we still have the stick in case we need it.
So the next question gets to this issue that we've raised a couple of times now, the distinction between tactical and strategic counterterrorism success. It seems quite obvious that we've had, at least in some pretty significant spurts, some great tactical successes. But one could make the argument that strategically we've had at least as much failure, as you described, a much more geographically diverse terrorism landscape, far more people radicalized to violence today than in September 2001. And I'd like to kind of add a piece to that, saying a lot of our conversation has been about how Western countries, the United States or France, should be dealing with terrorism in other places. What are the things we need to be doing to address the trends in radicalization that are happening not only abroad, but happening at home, whether it's of a jihadist nature or a far-right domestic violent extremist nature? I would argue that probably the number one area where we have not succeeded is in, for lack of a better term, it's a contentious term now, countering violent extremism. So can you speak a little bit to what we need to do in beyond militaries, beyond law enforcement, beyond sharp end of the spear, to try and get ahead of this problem set, including at home within our own countries?
Yeah, perhaps a short word on that. As you know, there were 5,000 to 6,000 Europeans who left for Syria and Iraq, and the French contingent was the biggest, with 1,300 people who left. And actually, we had no soft approach of counterterrorism or even counter-radicalization before this trend. And the French government really started to develop a PV approach, if you want, in 2013, 2014. So it was pretty late. And we've developed several plans. The last one was in 2018 with dozens of measures that deal with education, schools, or what's going on also in association, in sports clubs, in companies, in firms as well. So it's very broad. It basically deals with the whole span of the society. And it's very hard to assess the results. So what we have to do here also on this specific issue is to continue, because the trend that we've noticed in 2017, 2018, 2019 was a decrease of attention towards this PVE program. Besides the Ministry of Interior, there were much less interest as well. So what we said about the necessity to endure and last was not true only for the military, but also for all these societal actions that started a few years ago and that need to last for years. I think that after the assassination of this Professor Samuel Paty in 2020, it's even more obvious now. The thing is that it's hard to have the resources for that, and it's hard to convince because it's very complicated to show the results.
Louis, can I ask you to close out the hour with a final question?
Yes, sure. So as our US audience may know, France will have the presidency of the EU for the first semester of 2022. The EU is an actor that has a number of tools that are already implemented in terms of technical assistance, governance, development. In your opinion, should the EU play a leading role in CT in Africa in particular? And does it have the ability to do so?
No, I think we kind of skeptical, Mark and I, about the EU as being a lead actor in it has its role to play, and it played it. There's still a lot of things that we should definitely and we could encourage, but no, I think CT remains a national precinct for many actors, including in Europe. EU can have a great coordination role. They can bring about a lot of other aspects, and including maybe on the key aspects about the reasons why we have such a lack of strategic successes. Because I think, and there I cycle back to Marc's answer and Matt's questions. I think it's important to bear in mind, and to locals, and including to locals in our homeland. It's not about jihadism. It's never been. It's about political power. It's about who controls what. It's about a political project. And there, I think the EU can definitely have its own, inspirational project that it can help with. But for CT per se, strictly speaking, I think it will remain for quite a long time just a coordination actor that has its added value, but would not be a leading actor.
Super. Listen, I want to thank you all for taking the time to join us today for this event. There's a lot more to talk about, and a lot more that was covered in Marc and Elie's book, The 20-Year War, Jihadism and Counterterrorism in the 21st Century, and I encourage you to check it out. Marc, Elie, Louis, thank all of you for participating today. Really appreciate it. Wishing everybody a good weekend, a healthy weekend. Be well and take care.
Merci.
Thank you, Matt.
Merci beaucoup.
And go for the Red Sox.
Go Red Sox. There we go. Don't think a couple of people didn't put that in the questions. Not a question about counterterrorism. But what does it mean that Red Sox are on one side of my head and Hezbollah on the other? The answer, of course, is good and evil.
Well, we have two hemispheres in our brain.
Be well. Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.